So today we're going to test out some cheap watercolours, Crawford and Black and Wilko Let's Create. Hello there guys, so this week we're going to be testing out two separate watercolour sets against each other. Now what makes these interesting is that this is Crawford and Black 12-piece watercolour set, as you can see. I got this from the works for £3, but for also £3 I got the Wilko Let's Create watercolour paints. So I'm actually kind of scared about the quality of both these sets, so I actually went ahead and purchased a set of decent brushes that was pretty cheap. So these are the £3 Taklon brushes, and there's a pack of 10 of them for £3, same price as these two sets separately. And then these are the wash brushes from Boldmere as well. They're also from the works. This set of 3 was £2, and I was really intrigued by these because I've never actually seen them in the works. And I've recently been loving wash brushes. These will be great for swatches as well as laying down a really good large wash of colour. First, let's do the Wilko Let's Create palette. And let's do some swatches. So this is the Wilko Let's Create watercolour palette. It is £3 or £2.99. I can't quite remember, but I just rounded it up to £3 because it essentially was. My first impression of these swatches is that they were bright, they were pretty. Now my problems started as soon as they started to dry down. They just would not keep their colour and they became very chalky to the touch, and some of the colour would transfer off of the paper like proper chalk does. The colours became very muted and desaturated, and it was such a letdown. But because of this, I kind of thought to myself, maybe this could work, maybe I could try and make it work in my favour, and I started doing the painting that I would end up doing 2 of because I would compare both sets of watercolour. Just before I go through the application process, I will say my head does pop in and out throughout this video in terms of the speed paint portions, and my hair is not the tidiest because I did it while I hadn't brushed my hair, so you'll have to excuse how terrible my hair looks when I pop my head into frame. In terms of application, this paint was actually really fun to apply. It didn't have that kind of stress that you would feel about putting down paint. It was very easy to approach, and it was pretty easy to mix as well. However, there are more cons to this paint than first meets the eye. Now, I've already said about the colours being completely off once they've dried, and this caused problems later in the piece. But the one thing that I never really mentioned up until this point is that the paints would dry in the palette and then come off. I've had the same problem with Arteza watercolours in the past. It's fine, they're supposed to be wet use watercolours, which is okay, but I definitely also found myself using more and more and more of the paint. It just was constantly refilling the pans. One, because they're either dry or that I would run out of it really quickly. I can tell both of these sets of watercolours are student grade paints just right off the bat, but this Wilko paint seems to take the utter cake in terms of being a student grade paint because it just turns into chalk. It worked well with me while wet, but once it dried down or was in the process of drying down, it would instantly start working against me. It got increasingly difficult to lay all the colours down, especially because I was trying to get a great deal of contrast. For the artwork, I decided to draw my character Pele. She is my fire gothic princess, or one of 2 of my fire gothic princesses, because she has a sister called Pyra and a brother named Spyro. But these 3 actually have a really interesting trait where their hair is actually very much akin to their emotions and how it appears. So Pele's hair actually turns into lava, Spyro's kind of lights up like a Bunsen burner and actually changes colour to a blue flame, and Pyra's pigtails actually go into a fireball. So I really wanted to draw Pele with her lava hair because I thought it would make a really, really cool way to add contrast. And it's definitely a really good way in testing these paints for their work with contrast. I actually came up with this composition during the last video's worth of sketching for my scrawler box, but I didn't have the right colours available to me, so I kept it for a future video and I thought I would use it during this one. So now we're on to the Crawford and black paints. So these paints are actually from the works as well as the brushes that I showed you in the beginning. So funny thing about this whole video, originally it was just going to be the Wilko paints and that was that. But I saw these in the works and thought, wait, hold on a minute, these are exactly the same price. How about I do a video to compare them? And that's how this video was made into a concept that is now reality. So now we're going to talk about the colours. The colours turned out so much brighter than I was actually anticipating because I'd already swatched the Wilko paints at this point and was kind of comparing them already without even trying them. So they really took me aback right away. I think the main thing to note about the watercolour Crawford and black paints is that they acted a little bit more like gouache than watercolour. You can tell that it is still watercolour, but for watercolour it was incredibly thick and opaque and something that I wasn't expecting. I think that if you're having trouble using gouache and you like using watercolour, I think this is a very good happy middle ground for you, especially if you're a student and you need something really cheap, because I feel like this medium can actually act as both very well. Even though I was just talking about how this watercolour can be a good thing, on the opposite side, just playing devil's advocate for a second, because the watercolour is so thick and acts more like gouache, when trying to thin it out more like watercolour and how it's supposed to be, it's very weird. The consistency gets very weird. I don't know how to explain it. I just thought that it just didn't lay down the way I wanted it to. Not in a bad way, but in a weird I'm not used to it kind of way. And I've used so many different student paints over the years that this one definitely took me by surprise in the way that it worked. I'd say out of the Wilko and the Crawford and black paints, this one I definitely took longer on. The Wilko paints I could actually get right because the application process just felt easy. Even though they weren't great, the application process was easy, whereas this one had great output but not a easy application process, if that makes sense. They were very much opposites of each other and I found that really, really weird. How two paints can be exactly the same price from two separate shops and be so polar opposite in consistency and application. So as I said before, I use this composition as a huge test, especially with the lighting that I wanted to get in this picture, and with both really did surprise me in terms of trying to get the contrast. Now Wilko, I said it was pretty bad with trying to get contrast because everything died when it dried. Crawford and Black's paint didn't really have that issue at all. Mixing was good. I really enjoyed mixing these paints because I could get some really interesting shades. And I don't know whether people were paying attention to when I was first laying down the colours in this Crawford and Black speed paint, but I put down the colours incredibly thinly, even more thinly than the Wilko watercolours, and that is because of how thick the watercolours were. I didn't want to oversaturate the paper, and for anybody wondering, the paper I used was the Arteza watercolour paper. So I worked out how much each tube of watercolour would be in each of the sets, and for both of the sets, because they're £3 each for both of them, it would be 25p per tube, which is amazing. Now, I was actually also recently sent the full set of 60 Arteza watercolours, and it's about 67p per tube, if I remember correctly, which is by far some of the cheapest tubed watercolours I've ever seen. I know for a fact that there is cheaper watercolour, even more cheaper than these, but in terms of tubed watercolours, I really do think that these are the cheapest to get, because any cheaper than these watercolours and you're looking at sets that come as watercolour cakes, if there is watercolour tubes that are cheaper than 25p each, I would actually really love to know if you can find any. I'm really intrigued to know if there's anything cheaper than 25p per tube. So just a little side note, I thought I'd say that I use two water pots. One is a dirty water pot and another one is a clean water pot. This is so that I don't have to change my water as often. I have a lot of different water pots. Also throughout this video, my heat tool was essential because the drying times for these two watercolours were longer than I was anticipating. And especially with the lifting issue that I had with the Crawford and black paint, it really helped speed up the process of painting, because otherwise I would have had to wait in between every layer to dry. Now, I didn't use any excess materials except for a ballpoint pen. I ended up using that just to define a few details that got lost during the painting process. It's just all the paint, there was no excess materials. This is also the case with the Wilko painting as well. So now I'm actually going to compare and contrast these two images, and there is a quite heavy difference between the two. You can see which one got more contrast and which one decided to fade into obscurity. So this one is the Wilko paints and this one is the Crawford and black. You can see with the Wilko paints that it turned out really chalky, but by the footage that I recorded, it turned out okay while I was painting, but after it dried, it just lost all of its contrast. It lost all of the things that made it great. And yes, I do actually think that some of the blending, especially in the hair, I actually got decent, but I didn't get the full result that I wanted out of this one. I would definitely not recommend these paints, unfortunately. I really wanted to like them. I mean, I liked using them, but the way they dried and the aftermath of it just ruined it for me. Now, the Crawford and black, I have very mixed opinions on. Yes, the final result looks so much better than what I was actually expecting it to be. Just 10 times better than these paints, hands down. But there were some application issues that I was having while using the Crawford and black paint. The colours and the way that they dried were just so much better with the Crawford and black, and it kept that contrast. And the way it dried, it didn't do this, basically. It actually kept its contrast, which was great. Another thing to note about this paint is it lifted really well, and for people who like lifting paints, that's great. Its layering was okay as well. I really enjoyed doing that. It's just that the problem I had is I would have to wait until it was completely bone dry to start painting on it again. Otherwise, it would lift up the layers again and again. And you can see where that kind of happened around here. It just kept lifting and lifting no matter what I did. And I'm used to my paints, at least for the darker colors, staining at least a little bit. so I can create more depth and dimension. I was trying to do the same thing on the Wilko painting as I was doing on the Crawford and Black one, but as you can see, every bit of contrast died. I am so disappointed with how much the contrast and just everything muted very quickly. If that is the effect you're looking for, then that's great. So I'm just rubbing this part of the drawing because I did actually do quite a lot of layers on this part for both pieces, and I'm going to show you the transfer of the watercolours. Usually watercolours shouldn't really transfer, they should stick to the paper. But as you can see, this Wilko one transfers so badly. It's incredibly chalky. I would have absolutely cried at the thought of doing my artwork in this Wilko watercolour and it transferring all over my other pieces of work in my folder. So would I recommend the Crawford and Black paint for £3 compared to the Wilko? Yes, hands down, the Crawford and Black wins the day for me. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, you can click like and subscribe if you haven't already, with those post notifications on for notifications for every time I upload a video or live stream. I've been getting back into live streams recently and I'm really happy about it. So I will see you guys in my next video. Bye guys!